Hey guys, welcome back. Or maybe welcome for the first time, if you've just wandered in from the algorithm's midnight buffet of questionable video suggestions. Tonight, we're doing something calm, a little grim, but honestly, sort of funny if you squint at it sideways. We're talking about heads, detached ones. Specifically, what happened to the heads after public executions. Because, believe it or not, lopping off someone's noggin wasn't the final step in the process. Nope. There was usually a whole post-care plan, let's call it. And medieval people took this surprisingly seriously. So get comfortable, dim your lights, grab some tea, or just close your eyes and let this drone on in the background. Tonight, the story is slow, mildly grotesque, and perfect for dozing off to. Now, when we think of executions, most people stop at the dramatic bit. The axe falls, or the sword slices, or the guillotine does its thing. The crowd gasps. Maybe someone faints if they've got a delicate constitution. And then, credits roll, right? Wrong. Medieval and early modern authorities were very invested in what happened to the remains. Heads, in particular, were useful. Sort of like propaganda billboards, but significantly more fleshy. In fact, in many cases, the whole point of chopping off a head wasn't really about ending someone's life. Though, yes, that's obviously in the mix. The bigger goal was to show everyone else what happens when you step out of line. And there's really no better way to do that than by sticking someone's face on a stick and leaving it there to rot in public view. Let's start in England, because of course we are. The English were absolute overachievers when it came to head display. If you were executed for treason, which was the deluxe VIP crime category, your head had a pretty good chance of ending up on a pike over London Bridge. London Bridge wasn't just a bridge. It was basically medieval Times Square, packed with shops, houses, stalls, and yes, spikes with heads on them. Imagine crossing the river on your daily commute and looking up to see a row of slowly decomposing faces leering down at you. Fun morning vibe. Very motivational. And these weren't anonymous heads. They were labeled, announced, sometimes even recognized by passers-by. Oh, hey, that's Sir Thomas More. Didn't he write a book about utopias or something? Well, now he's providing free bird food. The bridge became this macabre hall of fame, constantly updated with the newest trader specials. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and also slightly gross. So bear with me. Heads rot quickly. They don't exactly hold up well in outdoor conditions, especially when you're sticking them on a spike with no shade in the middle of summer. So, to preserve the display a little longer, executioners sometimes did a quick preservation treatment. Yes, medieval people had a version of taxidermy for human heads. The standard method was boiling the head in brine, then coating it with tar. This not only slowed down the decomposition, but also gave the skin a nice, shiny, blackened finish. Think of it as the equivalent of putting on way too much tanning oil before a beach day. But instead of getting compliments, you just terrified pedestrians. Tarred heads could last for months, sometimes years, depending on the weather and how many crows decided to snack on them. So, when we talk about permanent displays, it's not just poetic exaggeration. Some of these things lingered long enough for children to grow up seeing the same grimacing face every time they crossed the river with their parents. But London Bridge wasn't the only place. Heads got prime display real estate all over the city. Tower Hill was another favorite, especially for the noble class. If you were fancy enough to get executed at the Tower of London, your head might be paraded around a bit first, before settling into its final spike arrangement. Sometimes, if you were really extra famous, your head got a mini farewell tour. Nothing like carting around a severed head through the streets so people could get one last look. Sort of like a twisted victory parade, but without the confetti. Now, not every head was destined for a spike. Sometimes, families requested the remains back. This usually involved a hefty bribe, since officials technically weren't supposed to hand over the goods. But if your relatives were discreet, and your family had deep pockets, you might avoid ending up as bird chow. One famous example is again Sir Thomas More. After his execution in 1535, his daughter Margaret reportedly bribed her way into getting his head. She kept it, quite literally, as a family heirloom, which, puts a whole new spin on keepsakes. Supposedly, it was preserved and passed down, eventually ending up in Canterbury. There's still a shrine there where people claim part of his head remains. Imagine visiting a church and being told, "And over here we have Saint So-and-so's skull. And oh yes, Thomas More's face in a jar." Very soothing. Meanwhile, in France, things worked a little differently, mainly because of the guillotine. The French Revolution industrialized beheadings like nobody else. Suddenly, heads weren't rare trophies. They were mass-produced collectibles. Instead of carefully spiking one or two heads as warnings, you might end up with baskets full, which created a kind of disposal problem. After guillotine sessions, executioners had to figure out what to do with dozens of heads at once. Sometimes they were buried in quick lime pits. Sometimes they were dumped in mass graves. And sometimes, because people are people, they were looted. Revolutionary crowds occasionally carried them around on pikes for impromptu parades. One particularly awkward day involved revolutionaries marching with the heads of guards and sticking them into the windows of royal palaces just to taunt the occupants. Again, subtlety was not their strong suit. But let's drift back earlier, to the medieval period again. Because the French also had their share of tarred head displays, Paris had its own bridges and gates adorned with traitor decor. If you think modern cities are covered in billboards, imagine replacing every other ad with a decomposing head. Much more memorable. And here's the kicker. People got used to it. Chroniclers mention London Bridge being decorated with 30, 40 heads at once, and nobody thought that was particularly strange. It was just part of the skyline. Oh, the weather's nice today, and looks like they've put up 3 new rebels overnight. Life goes on. Other parts of Europe had their quirks too. In Germany, it wasn't uncommon to mount heads above city gates, especially for bandits. A way of saying, "Welcome to Nuremberg. Behave yourself or you'll end up on the welcome sign." In Italy, Florence was particularly fond of using the heads of rival political figures. And in Spain, the Reconquista era meant lots of heads from both sides ended up as trophies on fortress walls. The Ottomans? Oh, they went big. Heads of defeated enemies, rebels, and traitors were sometimes piled into literal pyramids, because sure, Why stop at one? Go ahead and make architecture out of it. But let's pause here, because beyond the gore, there's this strange human element. Heads were personal. Faces are recognizable. Even centuries later, people still wrote about seeing them, remembering how they looked, and even being haunted by them in dreams. For all the pomp of medieval executions, it wasn't just about justice or cruelty. It was about memory. Authorities wanted you to remember the face of treason, rebellion, or whatever crime they were stamping out. And it worked. People described those faces for generations afterward. Okay, let's breathe for a moment. We've floated across bridges, stood under rotting faces, and peeked into tar-filled buckets. And this is just the start. Because tonight, we're only beginning our journey into the afterlife of severed heads. There's a whole world of rituals, mistakes, thefts, and downright weird stories waiting. But before we drift to the next tale, let's just appreciate the simple fact that for medieval people, a head wasn't just a head. It was a message board, a billboard, a warning sign, a conversation starter, or in some unfortunate cases, a family heirloom. So, where were we? Ah yes, heads on spikes, tar buckets, and the occasional family heirloom. Very cozy bedtime imagery. But let's float a little deeper now. Because if there's one group of people whose heads have had particularly dramatic post-execution careers, it's the royals. When kings, queens, and nobles lost their heads, they rarely just disappeared into the background. Nope. Their noggins usually became instant celebrity relics. Think of it as medieval influencer status, but with less Instagram and more crows. Take, for example, Mary, Queen of Scots. Poor Mary. She had the whole tragic resume. Born into royalty, married badly, imprisoned, and eventually beheaded in 1587 after Elizabeth I decided she was just too much trouble. Now, the execution itself was messy. The executioner needed more than one swing of the axe, which is not exactly ideal when you're trying to make a dignified royal exit. And to make things worse, her little dog, who had hidden under her skirts during the execution, refused to leave her body afterward. Yes, really sad and weird in equal measure. But here's the kicker. What about her head? Well, it was lifted up and shown to the crowd, as was tradition. "Behold the head of a traitor," the executioner cried. Except, awkwardly, he was holding it by the wig, and the wig came off. Mary's actual head, smaller, grayer, and less flattering, rolled away on the floor like a rogue bowling ball. Not exactly the royal dignity she might have hoped for. Her head was eventually sewn back together for burial, but even then, it wasn't left in peace. Centuries later, when her tomb was opened, the remains caused arguments about whether her head had even been buried with her body at all. Some people claimed it had gone missing at one point, which means there's a small chance that somewhere, in some dusty English collection, Mary's head is still out there, misfiled under miscellaneous curiosities. Speaking of royal mix-ups, let's talk about King Charles I, England. Beheaded in 1640, he was another celebrity head with a complicated afterlife. After his execution, his head was sewn back onto his body for burial, because apparently Presentation still mattered, even when you were very much dead. But the real drama came later, when Charles's coffin was opened in the 19th century. People discovered his embalmed head still looked surprisingly good. His beard was intact, and his features recognizable. Naturally, this caused quite a stir, because Victorian gentlemen absolutely loved gawking at corpses. Scientists, artists, and random dignitaries took turns inspecting him, sketching him, and writing about how noble he still looked. And then they quietly tucked him back away, because nothing says respect for the dead like a casual 200-year checkup. Now, not every royal head got the VIP preservation treatment. Some had much rougher journeys. Case in point, Oliver Cromwell. Not technically a king, though he sort of acted like one. Cromwell died of natural causes in 1658. Unfortunately for him, the monarchy was restored not long after, and Charles II decided it was time for revenge. So, Cromwell's body was dug up, hanged, and then beheaded. His head was stuck on a spike over Westminster Hall, where it stayed for about 20 years. But wait, it gets better. After a storm knocked it down, Cromwell's head basically went on a centuries-long road trip. It passed through private collectors' hands, was used as a macabre conversation piece in parlors, and at one point, it was even displayed in a museum where people paid to see it. Finally, in the 1960s, it was buried at Cambridge, meaning his head had a more active social life after death than most people do while alive. And then there's Anne Boleyn, the ill-fated second wife of Henry VIII. Beheaded in 1536, Anne's head was handled rather unceremoniously. Instead of being displayed, it was stuffed into a small arrow chest, literally the kind of box used to hold archery equipment, and buried in an unmarked grave at the Tower of London, which, if we're being honest, feels a bit insulting. From queen to storage box filler in about 30 minutes. But her story doesn't end there. Later renovations at the tower uncovered bones believed to be hers. But, plot twist, no one's entirely sure. Identifying royal bones isn't as precise as you'd hope, especially when multiple headless women were buried in the same chapel. Historians still argue about whether we've actually got Anne or some other unfortunate noblewoman. Imagine being the archaeologist trying to explain that mix-up. Of course, not all head stories are tragic. Some are just strange. For example, in the 17th century, the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe died and was buried in Prague. Years later, his tomb was opened, and scientists analyzed his mustache to check for mercury poisoning, which, yes, is exactly the sort of scientific question you'd expect from a man who once wore a prosthetic gold nose after losing part of his real one in a duel. His head didn't go missing, but the mustache samples made the rounds for years, as if they were VIP backstage passes. But let's wander away from royals for a moment and talk about stolen heads, because believe it or not, there was a minor trend in stealing them. The head of Oliver Plunkett, an Irish Catholic archbishop executed in 1681, was stolen multiple times before ending up in a church in Drogheda. It's still there today, displayed in a reliquary, looking extremely grim, but impressively intact. Pilgrims visit it, pray to it, and probably try not to think too hard about the smell it must have had in earlier centuries. Other times, heads were embalmed in alcohol. Yes, People really did dunk severed heads into vats of spirits, brandy, wine, even vinegar, which honestly sounds less like preservation and more like the world's worst cocktail garnish. Would you like a slice of lemon with that? Or perhaps the Duke of Norfolk's face? And then there were the pickling jars, heads suspended in liquids, usually by doctors or scientists, who were convinced this would somehow preserve both the appearance and the essence of the person. Spoiler, it didn't. Most of these jars ended up with cloudy goo and unrecognizable blobs. Still, it was the thought that counted. Heads as relics. Now, let's talk about the church. Because the church absolutely adored heads. Relics were the medieval version of collectible merch. The shinier, rarer, and holier, the better. And nothing was holier than a saint's head. Churches across Europe competed to outdo each other in the relics department, and if you could land yourself a full skull, or even just part of one, you were basically guaranteed a steady flow of pilgrims and their coins. But here's the awkward part. There were way too many saintly heads in circulation. Take John the Baptist, supposedly beheaded once. Yet, by the later Middle Ages, at least 4 different churches claimed to have his head, which led to the inevitable sarcastic commentary from skeptical chroniclers. Either he had multiple heads, or someone is lying. But of course, that didn't stop the pilgrims. And it wasn't just famous saints. Even minor local martyrs got the head in a reliquary treatment. Sometimes they were covered in silver, turned into fancy busts, or set with jewels. You'd walk into a cathedral, and there it was, a mummified face peeking out from under a golden crown. Spiritual inspiration meets nightmare fuel. Heads in science. Now let's wander into the so-called world of early science, because apparently, once people had heads lying around, they couldn't resist poking them. In the 8th and 19th centuries, phrenology became a fad. This was the science of reading bumps on skulls to determine personality. Spoiler, it was nonsense. But at the time, people took it very seriously. And what better way to practice than by digging up famous people's heads? Napoleon's death mask, Beethoven's skull, Shakespeare's supposed head. All of these became subjects of examination, measurement, and occasional theft. The idea was that genius could somehow be detected in bone structure. Spoiler again, it couldn't. But that didn't stop endless gentlemen with calipers from prodding skulls and writing long, boring essays about them. Even earlier, during the Renaissance, heads were used in anatomy lessons. Universities sometimes acquired freshly executed criminals' heads for dissection, sketching, or just plain gawking. Think of it as the world's least appetizing show and tell. Students gathered around while professors peeled back skin layers like they were opening a particularly grim orange. Heads that wouldn't stay buried. But perhaps the strangest part of head history is how often they refused to stay buried. Take Oliver Cromwell again. Dug up, reburied, redisplayed, reburied again. His head just couldn't catch a break. Or the case of Henri IV of France, whose head wandered through auctions and private collections for 2 centuries. When scientists finally tested it in 2010, they used everything from facial reconstruction to DNA tests to confirm it was him, and then they quietly reburied it again, because clearly Henri's head was sick of being passed around like a creepy party favor. Then there's Richard the Lionheart. After his death in 1129, his heart was buried in Rouen, his body in Fontevraud Abbey, and his entrails near where he died. But his head, well, technically part of it, at least, his skull, was examined in the 19th century, found to be crumbling and then placed back, meaning Richard ended up as one of the most scattered monarchs in history. Heart here, guts there, face somewhere else. Very organized. And let's not forget the case of King Henry IV of Germany. He died excommunicated, so his burial was a bit of a mess. His body was moved multiple times, and when it was finally reburied properly, people realized parts of him, including the head, had gone missing along the way, which is just another way of saying, we lost the king, check under the couch cushions. Heads, in folk superstition, heads weren't just relics or trophies. They also wandered into folklore. In some cultures, the head was believed to hold magical power. Celtic traditions spoke of head cults, where warriors collected enemy heads as charms. The belief was that the soul lingered in the skull, so keeping one gave you strength, or at least a creepy interior decoration. Even more absurd is the head of Henri IV of France. After his death in 1610, he was buried in style, but during the French Revolution, his tomb was looted and his head vanished. For centuries, it floated around in private collections, misidentified, and occasionally auctioned off. In 2010, a forensic team finally studied it and confirmed, yes, this was indeed Henri IV's head. It was reburied in 2011, after more than 200 years of basically being a wandering house guest. Now, while we're on this theme, let's not forget the sheer number of saintly heads floating around Europe. Medieval churches had a real enthusiasm for holy skulls. The head of John the Baptist was claimed by multiple locations, because of course everyone wanted that particular prize. Relics were moneymakers, and nothing drew pilgrims like a famous head in a fancy reliquary. The only problem? Sometimes the same saint had 3 or 4 heads being shown off in different cities, which, unless he was secretly a hydra, doesn't quite add up. This habit wasn't limited to saints. Lesser-known nobles and martyrs also got the head treatment. Some were pickled. Some were encased in silver. Some were mounted on wooden busts and given wigs to make them look less corpsey. If you ever wondered where medieval art got its creepier ideas, well, it probably started in the reliquary department. But back to executions. Let's be honest. Not every head was handled with care. Sometimes things went spectacularly wrong. Executioners weren't always skilled, especially when it came to nobles who expected a clean one-swing departure. If the axe missed the sweet spot, it could take several strikes. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, had one of the most infamous executions in 1541. She was in her late 60s, accused of treason against Henry VIII. The executioner was apparently inexperienced, or just nervous, and botched it badly. Chroniclers say it took multiple blows, and that she tried to run away mid-execution, turning the whole event into a horrifying slapstick routine. Needless to say, her head didn't get any dignified display afterward. It was a mess from start to finish. On the other hand, skilled executioners could turn the job into a weird kind of performance art. In Germany, executioners sometimes displayed the head to the crowd with theatrical flair, turning it side to side like a prize. In Japan, during the samurai era, heads of defeated enemies were washed, perfumed, and presented neatly arranged on wooden boards. Presentation mattered. even death could have good manners. So, what have we learned so far? Heads were trophies, warnings, relics, props, and sometimes wandering celebrities in their own right. Far from being discarded, they had busy social calendars, and whether tarred, spiked, or tucked and into arrow boxes, they stuck around in human memory for centuries. And honestly, isn't that the strangest thing? The body might vanish, but the head, literally the face of history, lingered on, becoming both symbol and spectacle. All right, that's enough wandering heads for now. In the next stretch, we'll drift into some of the quirkier details, how heads were preserved, the surprising ways they were used in medicine and science, and a few stories where heads were dug up, reburied, and dug up all over again, because apparently no one could leave them alone. But for now, let's just picture that quiet row of spikes on London Bridge, watching over the Thames. Rain dripping down, tar glistening, crows pecking. A little gruesome, a little ridiculous, and very, very medieval. So here we are again, still floating gently among disembodied faces. And I know what you might be thinking. Surely, at some point, medieval and early modern people would get tired of the whole head-on-a-stick aesthetic. You'd assume there would come a moment where somebody went, "Okay, enough already. Maybe let's just bury them normally." But no, not really. If anything, the obsession grew. Because once you've got a head, especially a famous one, the next question becomes, how do you keep it? How do you preserve it? And how do you make sure people believe it's still impressive long after the actual person has stopped being impressive? Heads as preservation projects. We've already talked about the classic tar and brine method, that sticky black coating which left heads looking like sad candied apples. But other methods cropped up too. Sometimes, instead of tar, executioners used smoke drying, which was basically the medieval version of beef jerky. You'd hang the head over a slow fire, dry out the flesh, and call it good. Result: a leathery, shriveled face that could last for decades. Perfect for terrifying children on their way to school. Even as late as the 17th century, some Europeans believed powdered skulls could cure illnesses. Apothecaries sold mummy powder, which sometimes included ground-up bones and heads. Yes, people were literally drinking head smoothies in the name of health. Delicious. Executioners even sold little pieces of skull as lucky charms. Dipped in wine, they were said to cure epilepsy, which means that somewhere, a medieval teenager had the awkward experience of mom saying, "Drink this, dear, it'll help your fits," and realizing it was basically skull tea, heads as political theater. And of course, let's not forget the continued use of heads as political statements. During the English Civil War, spikes on London Bridge featured the heads of both royalists and parliamentarians, depending on who was in charge at the moment. You could almost track the political climate by which faces were up there, like a grim version of swapping out storefront displays. During the French Revolution, heads were paraded through the streets on pikes. Crowds danced with them, kissed them, even spoke to them. Which, yes, sounds unhinged, but in a way, it was theater. The revolution wasn't just about killing people. It was about turning their very faces into symbols of victory or revenge. And in Japan, during samurai wars, heads of enemies were washed, perfumed, and inspected by commanders. The higher the rank of the head, the more respect in the warrior's resume. Head presentation ceremonies were formal, almost polite. Imagine bowing while handing over someone's carefully shampooed skull. A very different vibe from tarred heads dripping over bridges. The quiet afterlife of forgotten heads. But in the end, most heads didn't become relics, political trophies, or collector's items. Most just quietly rotted away, stuck on spikes until they fell into rivers, buried in pits, crumbled into dust, forgotten except for the occasional chronicler's note. And maybe that's the strangest contrast of all. Some heads became legendary, passed around for centuries, debated, revered, stolen, and reburied. Others were just anonymous skulls in forgotten graves. History's spotlight is uneven, even in death. All right, let's take a deep, sleepy breath here. We've drifted through tar, jars, reliquaries, skull powders, political pikes, and saintly duplicates. And the night still stretches ahead. Because next, we'll wander into stories where heads became full-on legends. Talking heads, miraculous heads, heads that supposedly refused to rot, and all the strange mythology that grew around them. But that's for the next section. For now, let's just picture a medieval apothecary shelf, lined with jars of herbs, and one suspicious jar with a floating, tar-stained head. A little absurd, a little eerie, and if you're listening in bed, hopefully just boring enough to lull you into dreams. So here we are again, still surrounded by an audience of very quiet, very dead faces. And if you thought people were already a little too obsessed with severed heads, just wait. Because once you add folklore and a touch of religious storytelling into the mix, heads stop being just heads. Suddenly, they start talking, glowing, refusing to decompose, and generally being way too dramatic for their own good. The myth of talking heads. Let's start with one of the weirdest traditions, the belief that freshly severed heads could speak. This crops up all over Europe. Chroniclers loved to claim that when a noble or saint was executed, their head didn't just slump silently. It delivered one last quip, sermon, or curse. Because of course it did. Take Saint Denis of Paris, a 3rd century Christian martyr. Legend says he was beheaded on a hill in Paris. Instead of collapsing, Denis calmly picked up his own head, tucked it under his arm, and walked several miles, preaching the entire way, which, if true, must have been the most awkward sermon ever. Imagine following a man carrying his own head through the suburbs of Paris while he mumbles about salvation. Unsurprisingly, medieval artists loved painting this scene. Denis is almost always shown casually, holding his own face like a handbag. Or there's the story of Anne Boleyn. Again, after her execution in 15, some witnesses claimed her lips kept moving for several seconds, as though in silent prayer. Now, modern science says this is possible. Nerves sometimes twitch after death, and muscle reflexes can create movement. But of course, people at the time spun it into divine symbolism. Anne's head wasn't just dead. It was performing one last spiritual cameo. And then there's Walter Raleigh, beheaded in 1618. One account says his severed head smiled, which feels a little too convenient, like propaganda in reverse. See, he was totally fine with it. But even so, the story stuck. His widow apparently kept his embalmed head in a velvet bag for decades, which is either devotion or the worst home decor choice in history. Heads that refused to rot. If your head didn't talk, the next best miracle was refusing to decompose. Because in medieval logic, holy people's bodies were supposed to resist decay. Rotting was for ordinary sinners. Saints? Their heads smelled like roses, or at least, that's what people claimed. The head of Saint Catherine of Siena is still on display in Italy today, looking disturbingly well preserved after more than 600 years. Pilgrims file past, whispering prayers, while Catherine stares back with the same unimpressed expression she probably had in life. Or Saint Oliver Plunkett, the Irish archbishop we mentioned earlier. His head, preserved in Drogheda, is darkened and shrunken, but still recognizable. Devotees consider its survival miraculous, proof of his sanctity. Skeptics might just call it a lucky combination of tar and good Irish weather. Either way, the result is the same. People line up to see it. And then there's the most famous non-rotting head of all, John the Baptist, or rather, the many Johns. As we said earlier, at least 4 different heads of John were claimed by various churches. Some looked surprisingly fresh, which only fueled their status as miraculous, whether it was careful preservation or just optimistic labeling. People believed. Heads as warning ghosts. Now, let's drift into folklore, where heads start haunting people. In English ghost stories, it was common for executed traitors to reappear, sometimes as full-bodied phantoms, but often just as heads. Anne Boleyn's ghost, for example, is sometimes said to wander the Tower of London, carrying her own head, because of course she is. If you're going to haunt somewhere, might as well keep the accessory that made you famous. Other tales describe spectral heads appearing at execution sites, glowing faintly as if the soul hadn't quite moved on. People swore they saw them on Tower Hill, drifting through the peak like eerie lanterns. Whether these were just tricks of light or overactive imaginations, they gave Londoners something to whisper about on cold nights. And in Ireland, legends of the Dullahan, a headless horseman, probably stem from the lingering association between decapitation and restless spirits. Sometimes, the Dullahan carried his own head, using it like a lantern to see into the future. A little unsettling, but very on-brand for European folklore. Heads in entertainment. As if ghostly heads weren't enough, people also turned severed heads into a form of, let's call it, entertainment. During the Roman Empire, executed criminals' heads were sometimes displayed in amphitheaters alongside exotic animals or trophies of war. It was a kind of bonus feature for the crowd. Come for the gladiators. Stay for the severed rebel face. In medieval times, jesters occasionally cracked jokes at executions, playing with the head after it was held up to the crowd. Think of it as proto-gallows humor. Literally, executioners themselves sometimes got in on the act, spinning the head around dramatically or whispering mock conversations with it. Yes, humanity has always had a dark sense of humor. Even in the 18th century, when the guillotine turned heads into a mass production industry, people joked about them. There's a famous anecdote about women sitting near the guillotine knitting, calmly gossiping about the expressions on the freshly fallen heads. Oh, did you see her pout? Terrible posture. Nothing like turning executions into live commentary. The cult of famous heads. But perhaps the strangest part of all is how some heads became celebrities long after their owners were forgotten. Take Dante's skull. After his death in 1320, his body was buried in Ravenna. But centuries later, Florence wanted him back because suddenly they realized exiling their most famous poet had been a PR mistake. When they tried to steal his bones, monks hid them. His skull was reportedly passed around for years, with pieces of it even chipped off as souvenirs. So, somewhere in Italy, there are probably little keepsakes labeled authentic piece of Dante's head or Beethoven's skull. In the 19th century, bits of it were taken during examinations of his remains. For years, fragments of his head floated around collections, studied and restudied, as if genius could be distilled from calcium. Spoiler, it can't. And then there's Shakespeare. Rumors swirled that grave robbers stole his skull in the 18th century. A ground-penetrating radar scan of his grave in 2016 showed disturbance consistent with a missing head. So, there's a decent chance the bard has been headless for centuries, which is ironic, considering how often he wrote about heads, ghosts, and tragic deaths. Heads as symbols of power. When you step back, what really strikes you is how heads, these fragile, awkward, mortal things, ended up as massive political and cultural symbols. Spikes on bridges said, "Obey, or this will be you." Reliquaries in churches said, "Come, pray, and leave a donation." Pickled jars in science labs said, "Behold, knowledge." And ghost stories whispered, "You can kill the body, but the head still remembers." Everywhere you look, heads were more than flesh. They became symbols, portable monuments, the one part of a person that, even in death, kept telling stories. The sleepy drift, and so we float, past Denny, carrying his head like a handbag, past Anne Boleyn, mouthing silent prayers, past Catherine of Siena's remarkably well-preserved face, and into the long line of forgotten skulls stacked in crypts. Some were worshipped, some were mocked, some were prodded with scientific calipers, and some were simply left to rot quietly on bridges until they tumbled into rivers. And through it all, the human fascination with heads kept going, because no matter how much people tried to bury, burn, preserve, or parade them, the truth is simple. Faces linger. People remember faces, and nothing makes a warning or a miracle stick in your brain quite like the sight of a head that refuses to behave. All right, that's enough miraculous chatter for now. In the next part, we'll drift into the quieter decline of the head display tradition, how Enlightenment thinkers tried to clean things up, how heads became curiosities instead of warnings, and why eventually people decided maybe it was time to stop dangling tarred faces over bridges. But that's for part 5. For now, let's just imagine Saint Denis walking down a Paris street, holding his own head, mumbling softly like someone who forgot their grocery list. Absurd, calm, and just boring enough to fall asleep to. By the 17s, Europe was changing. Empires were expanding, cities were growing, and polite society was suddenly very concerned with manners. coffeehouse debates, and powdered wigs. Public executions didn't vanish, far from it, but the spectacle around severed heads began to feel old-fashioned. After all, dangling rotting faces over bridges was messy, smelly, and kind of bad for business when you were trying to sell silk and sugar nearby. Tourists didn't love the idea of tar dripping into the river where they might be fishing. And besides, Enlightenment thinkers were asking awkward questions about human dignity, justice, and whether treating heads like garden ornaments was the best way to showcase civilization. From terror to tacky. In medieval London, heads on spikes had been a normal sight. By the 18th century, people were starting to complain. The philosopher Jeremy Bentham, for instance, described the whole practice as barbarous to the senses. Visitors from abroad often wrote about being shocked by the sight of half-decomposed traders leering over the Thames. It wasn't just about squeamishness. It was about image. Britain wanted to appear enlightened, modern, powerful, and yet the first thing you saw crossing London Bridge was a row of blackened skulls. It wasn't exactly the warm welcome of a global capital. By the 1770s, authorities began quietly phasing it out. Executions still happened, of course, but instead of leaving heads to rot in public, they were buried, or at least tucked away. By 1772, London Bridge saw its last set of heads. The tradition that had lasted centuries simply stopped. Not with a dramatic speech, not with a law, just with a collective shrug of, maybe we don't need this anymore. The rise of the guillotine. Meanwhile, in France, a different kind of head obsession was underway. The guillotine, introduced in 1792, was marketed as a humane and efficient tool of execution. Clean, quick, no messy hacking. Enlightenment approved. But here's the irony. The guillotine actually multiplied the number of severed heads in circulation. During the French Revolution, heads rolled daily in Paris. Crowds gathered not just to see justice, but to analyze expressions. People claimed you could tell what someone was thinking in the few seconds after decapitation. Rage, serenity, fear. Scientists even conducted little experiments, shouting at fresh heads to see if the eyes would blink in recognition. The display shifted from leave the head on a spike for months to watch it fall in real time. In its own way, it was still entertainment, just streamlined for the modern age. But once the revolution settled, the French too began toning it down. By the 19th century, guillotine executions were still public, but the fervor for studying heads began to wane. Society was moving toward quieter punishments. Heads in science. One of the strangest afterlives for severed heads came in the form of science. While governments gave up on spiking heads, doctors and scholars picked them up for study. Enter phrenology, the 19th century craze that claimed you could read someone's character by the bumps on their skull. If you had a large bump above your ear, you were supposedly good at music. A big bump on your forehead meant you were intelligent. Never mind that it was nonsense. People loved it. And so skulls, real or plaster cast, filled laboratories, universities, even parlors. Some scientists were more serious, though. Heads of executed criminals were dissected to study brain anatomy. Doctors wanted to know, did murderers' brains look different? Could evil be mapped in gray matter? Spoiler, they never really found anything conclusive, but it did keep the fascination alive. Heads were no longer tools of punishment, but of knowledge. The French physician Joseph Guillotin, after whom the guillotine was named, didn't actually invent the machine, but he did advocate for studying the moment of death, arguing that observing guillotined heads might reveal secrets about the human soul. Yes, even in the Enlightenment, the line between science and superstition was very thin. Museums of the macabre. As heads lost their role in justice, they gained a new one in entertainment, but in a quieter, museum sort of way. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, collections of skulls, mummies, and curiosities were displayed in cabinets. Wealthy gentlemen collected shrunken heads from South America, preserved skulls from battlefields, even death masks of famous figures. It was all part of the cabinet of curiosities culture, half science, half spectacle. The public, too, got its share. Wax museums displayed realistic death masks of executed criminals. Visitors could marvel at the serene or twisted expressions of the condemned, preserved in plaster. It was morbid, yes, but far more genteel than staring at an actual rotting head above a city gate. And of course, some skulls became objects of nationalist pride. The skull of Yorick the Jester, yes, the one Hamlet supposedly held, was claimed to be discovered and displayed. Napoleon's death mask circulated in dozens of copies. Even in death, faces sold tickets. The quiet burials of old traditions. By the Victorian era, the open-air display of heads was largely gone across Europe, not just because it was unsightly, but because the whole idea of punishment was shifting. Reformers wanted prisons, rehabilitation, and moral improvement, not public gore. That didn't stop ghost stories from keeping the old imagery alive. The Tower of London was now haunted by Anne Boleyn carrying her head. London Bridge, once lined with skulls, became a place where people whispered about phantom faces. The heads were gone, but their shadows lingered. Even in literature, the fascination stayed. Writers from Dickens to Victor Hugo evoked severed heads as symbols of tyranny, fear, or tragedy. The physical spikes were gone, but the cultural image was too juicy to let go. From warning to curiosity. So, what happened? Why did heads shift from daily horror to dusty relics? Partly it was sanitation. Cities were cleaner, priding themselves on paved streets, sewers, and public parks. Rotting heads didn't fit the aesthetic. Partly it was politics. Governments no longer needed to rule by terror alone. And partly it was just fashion. What seemed normal in 1300 looked barbaric in 1800. But in a way, the fascination never disappeared. It simply moved indoors, into books, cabinets, ghost tales, and eventually movies. Heads stopped glaring from bridge spikes and started appearing in museum glass cases, still silent, still symbolic, still strangely compelling. The sleepy drift. And so, as the centuries turned, the tradition that once defined city skylines faded. The wind stopped whistling through grinning teeth on London Bridge. Tourists no longer craned their necks to guess which blackened face was which rebel. Instead, the heads went underground, into catacombs, collections, whispers, from terror to curiosity, from spectacle to study, from screaming propaganda to hushed relic, the heads still exist, of course, in churches, in museums, in private cabinets, but they no longer rule the skyline. They just linger quietly, reminders of a time when faces were public billboards of fear